today. All right. We're going to go one more minute and then we're going to open this up because Lisa, Gina, and Pam are going to drop some jewels on us tonight, as usual. So we definitely welcome back Pam to slay it as usual.
Thank you, Kenny. Too kind.
Yeah, Ravi, I haven't been to Roscoe since like 2017. I think that was the last time I was there, but it was delicious. That's all I can say. And then after Roscoe's, I went to Randy's for donuts. Like it was just a really good day. Oh, and then I went to a speakeasy in Koreatown afterwards, which a friend of mine was DJing. That was just a good day.
What is Roscoe's? Like what kind of food?
Chicken and waffles.
Oh, okay. Love it.
All right. I'm going to stop that and stop the music and let's get it. All right. So welcome everyone to our final AAPI, or our Asian American, better yet, because I'm going to stop saying AAPI after the conversation I had with Pam the other day. But thank you so much for pulling up to our Asian American event. This is our second one. We had a writer's workshop 2 weeks ago, Lisa K-Flex, right? 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, right? Yeah, so we had a writer's workshop 2 weeks ago. That was really great. And then obviously, we want to continue to build our knowledge and just understanding and how to show up for this very special part of not just the roses, but this the community in our American landscape as well. So we have some amazing panelists, but I'm going to leave all that to Lisa to introduce them and just intro this. And we're just going to have a really great time in this hour. And, definitely throw your questions in the chat. Make sure that you're muted. And that's about it. But once again, welcome to the Rose Garden. And thank you for spending a little bit of your evening with us. Lisa, take it away.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kenny, for that wonderful intro. And hello, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Lisa. I'm a motion designer and also an all-around creative who has a passion in mental health awareness and especially with its impacts on the AAPI community. So welcome to our Wellness and Healing Town Hall, celebrating Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Month, featuring our two amazing panelists, Pam and Gina. So a little bit about Pam. After 15 years as a marketer and strategist, Pam transformed into an executive coach, DEI advocate, and she's also a co-founder of Agency DEI. And we also have Gina today to speak some amazing truth. Gina's mission is to facilitate others towards freedom. She is a practitioner of Taoist medicine, and she approaches each individual's treatment as a whole system. So really, really excited. Thank you guys again for making time to speak today. Before we start, just want to give a huge shout out to some fellow roses, Tiffany, who hosted a awesome We Write earlier this month that Kenny mentioned, and also just huge, massive kudos to Kristen, who really helped to put together this town hall. And lastly, do I need to say it? I will. Shout out to Kenny for everything. So yes, with all of that out of the way, just wanted to say, May is Asian American Pacific Islander Month, but it is also Mental Health Awareness Month. And with the rise of anti-AAPI sentiment and the horrible, tragic events that are happening around us, like the recent mass shootings, mental and physical health and wellness for our community and loved ones is just more important than ever. But luckily, our two panelists can really start to dive deeper and dissect and talk about how we can overcome this and incorporate more healing into our lives. So it's no secret that mental health is stigmatized in the AAPI community. This is for countless reasons: the perpetual foreigner stereotype, generational trauma, expectations, religious intolerance, the list goes on. But a huge part of this is that many people in the AAPI communities, they don't have a direct word or translation for mental health. It is a cultural barrier, it's a cultural difference. So Pam, could you talk a little bit about the nuances of how health is viewed within the Asian American community?
Oof, okay, we're starting big. I'm like big and broad. I mean, first, just set the context, right? Like we're talking about a continent that captures like 60% of the world's populations, right? So that's like almost 50 countries, that's 2,300 plus languages. I don't know how many ethnicities, but probably hundreds of different ethnicities. And so it's a really, really wide swath of people. And so I guess as a starting point, what I'll speak to is maybe something more Eastern Asian centered that's had connections or impact on South Asian culture, Southeast Asian cultures as well, kind of just due to immigration across Asia. But I'm going to kind of focus my answer around that because it's too kind of difficult to capture all of Asian America. But I think one major tenet or foundation of a lot of East Asian cultures and the influence of East Asian culture is a more collectivist mindset versus like an individualist mindset, right? Like you think about Western and European countries, we're very centered around the individual. And I guess growing up in the US, we're all centered around the individual. It's like self-reliance, like individual freedoms, like the individual is what is at the center. And we kind of pursue our interests, as an individual. Whereas in a lot of Asian countries, it's more collectivist mindset where it's about the group, right? It's about the community, or it's about the family unit. Like different, depending on the context, it might be the family unit, it might be the community, it might be the government, right? So it's very much centered around the idea that we each sacrifice for the greater good, right? And that you each sacrifice for the group. And the interests of the group is far more important than the interests of the individual. And so then you get kind of, additional, I guess, more specific things. And some of this is founded in Confucian philosophy, which has also kind of spread across a large part of Asia, is the sense of deference, right, towards authority and lots of like kind of rule abiding sentiments, right, in the sense of, you have to suck it up, like you kind of suck up your own sacrifice in order to kind of benefit others. And so I think that if we look at that foundation as a starting point, I think it's easier to understand kind of the challenges with then being like, oh, as an individual, mental health is so personal and so unique to each person. And how things affect us is going to affect each person so differently. But to center that experience and to prioritize that, it kind of runs counter to a collectivist mindset, right? Because it is very sacrificially oriented, and it's more about, kind of deprioritizing yourself. So I think I'm just going to kind of start it there because I think is it for us to kind of just set the context of some of those foundational things and impact the difficulties around talking about mental health. And what builds off of that is then the difficulty around talking about emotions, right, which are also so individually based and so unique to the person. So in a lot of Asian cultures, there isn't even the language or the practice of talking about how you feel or even asking each other how they feel, right? Beyond how are you today, but even getting into emotions and really dissecting emotions just isn't very common practice traditionally. Though I think for a lot of us that grew up in the US, that's kind of shifting, right? Especially as we are first generation or second generation and here, multi-generations, you start to kind of adapt that language. But traditionally that isn't really part of the culture and part of the community. So I'll pause there.
That was fascinating to hear all the things you were bringing up, because it was conjuring up all of the discourse and the languaging around acupuncture here. So I grew up here. I was born in Los Angeles and I grew up here, but my parents were both from Vietnam. So I'm Southeast Asian, but I'm practicing acupuncture. And the way that it has been professionalized here is very, it's marketed to be Chinese medicine. And, China was very influential in carrying over what we perceive to be acupuncture and Taoist medicine. And one of the things that I feel people are drawn to is the concept that we are a mind, body, spirit, whole system. And it's interesting because I have no idea how this was actually practiced, or how over in China or Japan or Korea or Taiwan or Vietnam or the multitude of other places where this is practiced, what this means for those local cultures. But here, it's really accepted because it provides that access between mind and body that we don't usually get to grapple with. So it's fascinating for me to be able to talk about emotions because it's also through this Western lens and like creating all these bridges between Western medical, Western psychological understanding of the mind and emotions. But then there's also this concurrent development here where now there's somatic therapy. Now we're really looking at what that connection is with mind and body. And in a larger way, we're looking at how health and wellness and what we perceive to be balance of that is also an incorporation of us as a microcosm, us as in connection to our environment and the people around us and the nature around us.
Yeah, that was really, really beautifully said, both of you. Thank you so much for your input. Gina, I do have a question for you, specifically when it comes to practicing acupuncture and looking at health and wellness through an Eastern lens. Is there kind of a tie with both of those, like mental and physical health, being kind of considered one thing? Or could you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure, yeah. So acupuncture, all of acupuncture is founded upon Taoist theory. So it's this understanding of health, of everything being this separation between yin and yang. So there's the whole, the one, and then there is a separation. And so that's how, from Taoist cosmology, you understand there to be everything between the heavens and the earth. And from there, people and phenomenon and everything that happens is all understood from this place of oneness, of this place of connection. And so then our treatments are then framed as, how do we understand these natural rhythms? How do we get back in touch with these natural cycles? And this ties in well with everything that can possibly pop up around environmentalism, around politics, around world affairs, around interpersonal relationships or interrelationships, because it's all an understanding of how things are so temporary and how things are so interconnected. And so therefore, we have to just get in touch with those rhythms. I wasn't sure if that answered your question, did it?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it's interesting because from a Western lens, even talking about treating mental health, it is so looked at as like, just like, what can you do for just your mind? And it's not really looked at like holistically, like what are like these other areas that you can improve that might help your mental health. It's oftentimes like, you know, turning to medication and other things like that. So I think it's really beautiful to kind of approach it a little bit more as like a whole system and having everything be really interconnected. But yeah, you know, talking about acupuncture, it really brings up like when I was personally growing up, and my mom, who is an immigrant from China, she used to practice a lot of like traditional Chinese medicines and like wellness techniques on me. Like if I was feeling sick, she would like squeeze my pressure point here. She would give me herbal, yeah, I'm seeing nods. Yeah, she would give me herbal medicine instead of Tylenol and all of these different things that as a child growing up, you know, in a Western area around a lot of white people trying to reject my oh, sorry. Hello. Okay, sorry about that. You know, I think that caused me as a younger child to kind of reject those practices. But as I've gotten older, I've really learned such a beautiful appreciation for where my mom was coming from. And it also, you know, in Western medicine now, a lot of these Eastern healing techniques are becoming more popular. And it does seem like it is from, you know, a bit of whitewashing, like Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow, really popularizing these different techniques. And Gina, I was wondering if you could dive a little bit deeper into the history of how this came to be.
Sure, yeah. There's this really useful 19th century post-colonialist scholar, Edward Said, and you may have heard of his name if you studied art history. That's how at least that's how I first learned about him. But during that time of European exploration and colonization, there was this cultural, scientific way that the colonialists and Westerners were exploring, defining, ascribing what is the Orient. And at the time, it was the Middle East, right? But over time, the Orient became more and more encompassing of everything reaching over to East Asia. And when we think about the Orient, and when I say we, this is a very broad we, but there's things associated with it, maybe certain colors, certain imagery. So Orientalist paintings back about the Middle East all were about the harem and this like focus on women and women's bodies. And because of that, there's this hypersexualization and fetishization of Asian women at the same time that there's this emasculation of Asian men and all these other assumptions that led to this implicit bias between the separation of the West and the East, defined by the West, in a way that then there's this dominating and restructuring and sense of authority that the Westerners can have over the Orient. You also have concepts like first and third world country, developed and developing country, which is all made up. But it has real consequences, of course. So with that, in the 70s, there was a lot of pop culture Orientalism, and that was when there was a lot of interest in Eastern philosophy. So things like acupuncture and Ayurvedic medicine and yoga and everything Eastern became popular enough that people started diving into it. But with that, it's not like these things didn't exist before, right? For as long as there were Asian people here, all of these things had existed, but now we're able to market it in a way that is more palatable for the Western lens. And it's made more profitable for various organizations and individuals who already have access to promote these things. And largely, I can say with acupuncture specifically, since the 70s, first off, it was legalized. And that whole decade, between the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of backlash for the communities who were practicing acupuncture. Over in here, California, there's Miriam Lee, a really famous acupuncturist who was treating out of her apartment, but the acupuncture profession hadn't existed yet. So she was actually in court and she was about to put into jail, but her client showed up and pleaded for her and for them because she was their doctor. There is a great movie, Dope as Death, that also details the Black Panthers and what they did in the Lincoln Detox Center in the South Bronx. And it was a lot of detox for dope, except there was that tension between the biomedical conventional doctors, local police, and you can imagine how it gets really muddled when we're talking about the Black Panthers. But we see that. And then over the last 30 to 40 years, now we're still battling issues like whether or not the word Oriental is appropriate to describe acupuncture and institutions and why it's on our degrees. And we see that the profession is predominantly made up of white women and the institutions are run by white men. And it's all from this concept of this separation and how there's like this exoticization of this medicine. And now there's an attempt to incorporate it into Western care, but it's complicated. And I have my hopes that it can get worked out, but there's so much nuance to the topic.
I'd love to add something to that because I just saw something recently that kind of perfectly illustrates what all the pieces you were just talking about. So there was a interview that the CEO of Headspace, so I think a lot of us know Headspace, right? It's a meditation app that was started by a monk, or ex-monk. I think the CEO is now not the monk anymore. It's probably like a more business-centered CEO. There's an interview where a woman was asking him very pointedly, right? Like, what are you going to do, or what do you feel about the fact that many South Asian, because so much of meditation is from Gina was saying Eastern culture, or Asian cultures. And she directly asked him, what are you going to do to address, or how do you feel about addressing the fact that there isn't very much South Asian and East Asian, or just overall Asian representation in the world of meditation, and what do you plan to do about it, and how do you plan to address it? And he started his answer with, well, we're science based or backed or something like that, right? And this notion of exotic, I think this builds off to a degree, a more kind of insidious degree. Like it's not just the exoticization of, it's that it's not good enough as is, right? And that there's kind of this like twist that Western culture needs to put on things that have existed for centuries that is actually very science backed. It's just not necessarily in the same exact format that Western medicine frames things. But the notion of science backed, or the notion of improved, or the notion of, making it palatable in a way that is somehow more civilized, I think has been a trend across so many things that Western culture has taken from other cultures, right? And this ties to the company like Breakfast Cure. I don't know how many people remember them, but they're a company based out of Oregon that basically took Chinese congee, which is rice porridge, right? And made it in this like instant kind of packety kind of way. And it was just like the improved version of congee, how she discovered it when to heal herself. And then she literally on her website, it's taken down since, but there's many articles that cover this, where she talked about she improved it and now it's like making it better for white people pretty much, right? And has no attribution to the history of and the benefits of that have been around for centuries. But this happens just over and over, I think, across all cultures that are non-Western or non-American. And if there's a way to commercialize it, like, Goop does this all the time with Gui Shui, right? Like it's I don't know how many people have seen it, but now I see Gui Shui tools added into like makeup kits, right? Or like they're just thrown in as like this bonus item if you buy like beauty products. But it's a very traditional form of like healing. And anyway, yeah, the culture vulture thing is really real. But I just wanted to share a few examples that builds off Gina's point.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, that piece about civilization is an interesting one for me, because if we're talking about how things become developed, what we're really talking about is a greater disconnection from ourselves and from natural rhythm. So if we're looking at something that has been done for 2000, maybe 5,000 years, and it's clearly the evidence is in the fact that it's persisted. The evidence is in the fact that it's been effective enough that it's been carried down all these generations. But the scientific with a giant S, right? That lens, instead of being able to understand globally that science and most things that we take to be truth or based on facts is still, it's all culturally embedded in what creates meaning for us and what creates meaning for our communities and what actually is important for our communities to thrive with. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, totally. Right. And it's wild that like hundreds of years of proof is not enough, right? Like, because I'm like, the scientific method is literally experimenting over time and iterating, right?
Right. Yeah. And it's only been around for so long compared to these more ancient medicines with like much longer lineages.
Yeah.
I'm muted. Yeah, 100%. Really, really good points from both of you. Something that I was thinking of whilst you guys were talking is this commercialization of like Eastern holistic medicine in places that do practice these medicines, like massage parlors, acupuncturists, even different salons that do employ Asian American, Asian women. They tend to be, they're underpaid, they're typically immigrants, they don't have as many rights as their white counterparts. Is there anything that either of you guys can answer? Is there anything that we can do as supporters of these establishments to support these women?
Oof.
I know, I'm dropping really hard questions.
Wait, you mean the women that work in these institutions, right? Like Asian
Yeah.
women, immigrant women. Yeah. I mean, I can start. I have a few thoughts because so I grew up in New York. From the time that I was little, I went to these like, these Chinese like Asian massage places. That's where my mom went. Doctors, we would go to an Eastern doctor instead of a Western doctor, right? So like that was just very much part of the upbringing, or reflexology, right? Like all of those things are just very normal and everyday practices. I think as I've gotten older and I've understood the money dynamics of it, I think what we're talking about at the end of the day, it still comes back to human connection, right? It's like even, even some of the stuff you were talking about, it's that kind of like connection to natural things, but also the connection to each other. And I find so often like I don't do my nails or anything like that, but I every time I walk by a nail salon, because it's usually a glass storefront, I'm always like struck by how there's just no interaction between the people sitting in the seats and the people on the other side of them, right? There's no conversation. It's not like it's engaging. Um, and granted, sometimes there's a language barrier, but I remember, I mean, right now, I guess a few things I'll share. So the massage parlors that I go to, I always ask them questions, right? Like, where are they from? Like, what was their life like? Why did they come here? If you understand these stories, so many of these women have left their families, their children. They are literally sending money home so that they can kind of make or help their family survive back home. I have the woman who is my like waxer. She has not seen her husband in 12 years. Like her son is with her here, but her husband is back in Nepal, and she has not seen him in 12 years, but she sends money back all the time, and she hasn't been able to afford to go home, but she's hoping to kind of build up and make enough here so that she can go home one someday. Gui Ma, the woman that was killed in Elmhurst, the Chinese woman, she wasn't working in the massage parlor, but her and her husband had this sense of like, we're going to come here, make money for our family, even though they were retired, but their son had a grandson, or their son had a child, and they were like, we're going to make some money in the US, save up for our family back home. So it ties back to that family collectivist mindset. So as a starting point, I'm kind of like, how can you get to know these people so you can care and give a shit, right? Like, so that there's some connection, and even understanding some of the economics. Like most of these women don't make money from the fee that you're paying. A lot of them might get a very, very small percentage of the manicure, of the massage, but it's usually just a couple of dollars. So they're almost entirely tip based, just like hospitality. And so when a massage is like, an hour massage, some places are very cheap. It could be $40, $50. They're getting like $5 out of that, $7 out of that. And so they're entirely dependent on how much you decide to tip. So when people do like, oh, I'm going to do even 10% or even 20% or 25%, that's only $10. Right. And they've just, that's an hours of work. So if you understand the economics of these businesses and you understand kind of who these people are and kind of what they're doing here, that hopefully like builds the empathy, right? And then you are exchanging, it's still valuable work. So it's not at all to belittle like the labor that they're doing, because it's really valuable labor that they're doing. But understanding the economics and understanding the human connection of it, I think allows us to build the empathy so that we can also figure out how we play within that system. So right now I tip at minimum like 50%, if not 60%. Depending on the price or whatever it is, right? So those are the kinds of things, the more you understand the context, the more you can engage in a way that's respectful and also kind of honors their work.
Beautifully said. Shower. It's a big one. And I mean, I feel that one too, because I work on bodies. So it makes a big difference. If you can, sometimes you get there after the gym, but most of the time you do have some time to clean up, and it helps a lot if the person who's going to be working on you for the hour and a half does not have to smell your stink the whole time. But yes, tip heavily, because if you sit and you just think about what you're putting your money into, what you're voting for with your money, like really break it down. This is a person who's going to be getting into your bag, getting into your body. Really, at the end of your session, you typically walk out of there feeling amazing, feeling lighter, feeling like you're going to tackle the world in a certain way. But if you're trying to find the cheapest place, like what are you really investing in here? Because it's not just about you. This is an interaction with you and a whole other person, and a person who's offering up so much energy and time so that you can be better with your livelihood. So yes, tip heavily, and it really goes with everybody. I don't think it's especially useful to just think about just massage workers, but like in any place, especially with the amount of fetishization that comes along with being Asian and or a person of color, like just see them as the whole person that they are. And I feel like if you approach every interaction like that, you can't really go wrong, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think bringing full circle, it's like the human connection part, right? It's just like,
Yeah.
even if you don't share a language, like we have Google Translate, right? Like we all travel internationally and like can figure that out. And so I actually was at I was getting there. I was there for a wax, but I was at a nail salon, and there was a woman who walked in, and a lot of the people there don't speak a lot of English, but she seemed to be a regular. She was a white woman in a Chinese business, and she found ways to engage, right? Like like found she knew the owner, like they knew about her pregnancy, so he spoke English. But even the woman she ended up working with, she didn't speak much, but like she tried to connect. We have body language, and we have so many things that we try to connect with. And so in a lot of these spaces, it's like, how can you make sure that you are present as a human being and trying to interact with this other human being and not seeing them as a service provider?
Yes, presence, awareness, because you also don't want to go in there with like a checklist of things that you want to do, right? You don't want to force them to talk about their lives if they're really like, it's the end of the day. I just want to get this massage done and go home.
Right.
Meet
And
people where they are.
right, no, exactly, right? Because then it's like there's no right thing to say. It's not like here's the script. It's
Mhm.
like interact with a human like you would any other human, right? Feel it out, vibe it out, and like see how best to approach it. But I think so often the mindset, I mean, the chat is kind of talking about this too, like the mindset that you go into those spaces with, oftentimes I see it just feels so transactional for so
Mhm.
many people that I think you don't think of it as like, oh, I'm this person is working on my body right now or doing something for me. It's just like, oh, I'm getting the service and they're giving me the service, and that's kind of it. Which I think a lot of these places people approach with that. Um,
Yeah, 100%, 100%. There is something like interesting to me that when I do go into these establishments, and I am serviced by other Asian women, there is a part of me that feels a little bit like, especially like if I'm in like a salon, say, and I'm like an Asian woman getting serviced by another Asian woman, and I see all these other white women getting serviced by Asian women, there's something that feels uncomfortable there for me of not wanting to see another Asian woman like serve me per se, but it is important to remember too that a lot of these workers find great pride in their work, and it's not seen necessarily as a service. It's art in many, many forms. So it's super important to take away as well.
yeah. I mean, this isn't straight up about our wellness per se, but I think one other note that I wanted to bring up is this hasn't made. I don't think this has made a lot of headlines. Like certainly last year, Atlanta and the shootings in the spas made a lot of headlines, and then most recently in Dallas, like I don't even think that made many headlines, but that was a Korean salon. But in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, there's a lot of Asian-owned massage parlors and different kind of nail salons and those kinds of services. This past year, so two women were killed earlier this year at massage parlors, and but over the course of the past year, there have been like 30 to 40 robberies at these businesses, and some have been hit 3 to 4 times. And so I think it's impossible to kind of divorce like the fact that some of these businesses are cash businesses. They are seen as easy targets, and especially if it's a lot of Asian women, working in them, there's that kind of docile, submissive like stereotype that also falls into it, and they become or they're seen as easy targets. So there's that dynamic as well that I'm not trying to kind of solve within this call, but I just want to raise that there are other kind of components that for us to consider as far as how these businesses are viewed and perceived and how they're targeted by people who see them as potential opportunities.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for raising that point, Pam. It's super important to yeah, we are not going to solve it on this call, but it is just to think about it and to put it out there is super important. To turn the conversation a little bit into mental health. Again, I know we dipped a bit into like the wellness and how, full health wellness ties into mental health. But going back to specifically mental health, it ties so closely with work. It's something that's so important because studies really show that it's pretty obvious, but negative impact on your mental health is going to affect your friendships, your self-worth, and ultimately your work and your job as well. It's going to make you question yourself as you go into the workplace. So I want to dedicate the rest of our time to talking a little bit about like how we as roses can take different elements of healing and wellness into our lives to better our mental health and put our best selves forward into life and also into work and our careers. So Pam, if you don't mind talking a little bit about how you see the responsibility of an employer when it comes to health and wellness versus that of an employee.
Hmm. As in, like, how can employers support their employees?
Yeah, so how can a employer help to support their employees, and where is that line of like, how can a company actually support its employees versus like, what can an employee do to help
Mhm.
themselves?
Got it. Yeah. Um, ooh, um, I think what's really challenging, and this ties kind of to the broader world of like diversity, equity, inclusion work, but um, I think what's challenging for a lot of employers, which has been interesting to navigate and see the last 2 years, is this sense of like, okay, if we do something for one group, we have to do it for all, right? Like this notion of like, kind of equal provision of services or benefits or considerations. And I think there are more employers that are starting to not just challenge that notion, but recognize that that's really difficult, right? Because each individual, first and foremost, deals with such different things. And then on top of that, each group deals with very different systemic things. So, as an example, there's a recent study that Bain, so Bain, the consulting company, just did, and I can drop the link in a second. But it was specifically centered around Asian Americans and how included and inclusion in corporate America. And Asian women and Asian men out of every gender racial group were the two lowest, Asian men being the lowest. Um, and surprisingly, kind of white men were in the middle. And I think the people who felt the most included were LGBTQ women and Latina women. So that study was centered around Asian Americans, but I'm like, just understanding, if you look at something like that, right, like then inclusion for certain groups that's going to be affected by different things, and needing to address it in a very specific way for that group, I think, is what tailored care actually looks like. Because if you think about the anti-Asian sentiment and hate crimes in the last 2 years, the fear that specifically Asian people, and then Asian women feel in terms of leaving their homes and going to work is very different than everybody else, right? And the way that the fact that Asian women have been targeted way more in terms of hate crimes or just anti-Asian sentiment, that's going to affect their mental health totally differently, right? That's kind of this insidious, pervasive anxiety and stress that just sits below the surface. So applying the same policy or service or consideration for all women versus Asian women, like, just doesn't make any sense, right? And that's not to say you aren't considered of your overall population of women employees, but I think taking a more tailored approach is actually required. Though I don't think our employment practices line up with that just yet. So I'm going to use that as an example, like anti-Asian hate and the anxiety that comes up. I've talked to a lot of women this past year and directed them to employment lawyers who are like, because essentially you can't say, because I'm Asian and because of these hate crimes and I feel kind of concerned for my safety and I'm being targeted, that's not a legal excuse to get a concession from work, right? Unfortunately. Like, the employer can be like, well, that's not my problem, essentially. However, the employment practices are such that if you have anxiety and you say, don't tell them why you have anxiety, but you're just like, I'm feeling anxious and it's causing me to, kind of be concerned about my travel to work, then an employer doesn't necessarily have to give you a concession, but they have to at least go through the process of considering your situation, understanding your situation, and trying to find some kind of solution for it. They may not ultimately give you a concession, but that's a better pathway to a concession. So that's what I mean by like our laws and our structure, our systems aren't set up to be adaptable for the individual or individual needs of groups. But I think it needs to go in that direction. But in the meantime, there are ways to kind of navigate it so that you get kind of what you need. Um, sorry, it's kind of a long answer, and I don't know if I fully answered it, but I think this is where employers who are being a little more brave and being more willing to open themselves up to criticism by their employees who are saying, well, if you're giving them that, you have to give us that. Like, no, I don't, right? Because I don't give everybody maternity leave. I don't give everybody paternity leave, right? Like there are specific situations that we allow for. And I think we need to allow for more situations that are based off individual needs.
I feel like employers could be a lot better with receiving feedback from employees, because if there was just some kind of system set in place so that there was constant surveys and like groups and all of that, then there would be a greater ability to understand where people are coming from. I mean, specific to just COVID, you know, like how many employees still don't have healthcare, or if you can't provide healthcare, then can you at least provide resources for people? So if they felt like they can come to their manager or to whoever their higher ups are, at least have somebody for them to talk to, somewhere else for them to go to. I think there's also a piece with, where I currently work, I've seen a trend with where I work and broadly that people are starting to understand how valuable transparency is in corporate settings. It makes for people to trust better, especially with like this mass, at least from what I've seen, this phenomenon where people are saying, I quit my job because it's toxic. People are starting to understand that it's not just the money or whatever conception of success or prestige or wealth there is for them, that how people feel, how people are connecting to each other is so much more important. And after COVID, you know, this is such a great opportunity for both employers and employees to really establish, what do we really want our work culture to look like? What do we want our culture broadly to look like? And we could do that, not that it's easy, but we can attempt to do that by really modeling what that transparency looks like. Like, how do we show up in a way that's like, I'm not just here to do work. I'm a person, I'm a whole person who has personal interests, has all these other responsibilities in my personal life that I have to deal with, all of the political and social barriers that I have to deal with. And so when somebody says, hey, good morning, how are you? Don't say that you're fine if you're not fine. You know, you also don't have to unload all your trauma onto whoever asked you, but be honest about it. I'm upset because there was a shooting this weekend. Like, give your employer the chance to be vulnerable with you. Give your employer the chance to build that empathy, because it is, you know, unfortunately, it requires, you know, both sides to be doing something. We can't just have an expectation that employers are suddenly going to understand, oh, there's these things because there's a study that was finally done and the results are being shared. You know, by the time that happens, it's already been months or sometimes years before people understand that the facts show that this is the case. Meanwhile, there's always opportunities, even if it's not directly to your manager, for just the people around you to show up as the whole person that you are.
I 100% agree with that, Gina. Like, I think the ability to kind of actually ask for what we need. I feel like there's a bit of a work revolution the last few years where people are like, oh, yeah, I can prioritize myself, right? Which is, you know, I think facing your mortality with COVID will do that to people. But I wanted to kind of bring it more personally. I mean, maybe not bring it. What I mean is, kind of bring it in the context of like a lot of Asian cultures. is so my like main like my what I do for for my profession is coaching, and I do have like a lot of Asian clients, and their biggest struggle, or so many of them, there's a very thematic struggle across all of them, which is they've been suppressed for so long by their families or their upbringings. So some of the anecdotes or some of the things that people say are just like, I don't remember, like, because a lot of our work is around helping them figure out like what would fulfilling work, careers and lives look like, and how do they get there, like what do they want to do with their lives. And the struggle for so many of them in that starting point, when we start with like kind of open dreaming blank canvas exercises, is they really struggle to really outline what they want as an individual, not even in their work, right? Just because so many of us grew up in environments that were very suppressive, not only of your emotions, but of your needs, of your wants, of your opinions, of your dreams. So many immigrant families that grew up in the US are about survival. And that's not just Asian culture, right? It's just immigrant mentality. It's about survival and financial security and keeping a roof over your head and putting food on the table. So in Asian culture, I think there's just, a higher emphasis, or at least my understanding, I mean, I know this personally, is like there's an emphasis on certain professions, certain paths. So I have clients who are literally like, I don't remember, I can't think of a dream that I've had. Like even as a kid, like I can't think of the last time I dreamed. Or someone I know who is a dentist, a Korean man, is like literally has said, I'm waiting for my dad to pass away so I can stop being a dentist, right? Like these kinds of pressures, like from the schools you go to, from the professions you have, and even if you choose a profession, to the companies you work at, like there's so much pressure to live a very specific path. So I think, Gina, what you're talking about is really important, but so many people haven't even gotten to the point of being able to acknowledge what they want for themselves and their lives overall, in their families, right, amongst their loved ones, that to do so in an environment where your financial security is dependent on that. And then you want to kind of, to do what you're talking about, you have to challenge a status quo, right? Then it's like, that's really terrifying, because it's like better to kind of just keep the status, like not to rock the boat, and not to kind of upset your kind of financial stability. And so I think you're totally right. I just don't know if a lot of people are still making their way towards that step of challenging authority in the workplace, when they're still struggling with challenging authority within their families and their loved ones. Like even my mom, like I didn't go to the college she wanted me to go to. And so she like didn't come to my high school graduation and didn't talk to me for 4 months, right? So it's like those are the kinds of things that as a kid you deal with on such a regular basis, that by the time you reach your job or corporate America, like you've been so trained to suppress so much, that to try and break free and start practicing in your, maybe in college you started, or maybe in corporate America you started, you're so many years behind so many people who've been practicing sharing their opinions since they were children, right? Because their parents asked, what do you want, right? Or what do you like, or what do you think? So that muscle has to be built. And I hope, more of us are engaging in that, building that muscle, even if we didn't get the practice as kids.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up, because I really have to, we really have to honor that process, that whenever it is that you feel capable of even acknowledging that that's something you're upholding, the ideals of success, which, it is familial. And I understand that, because I don't know how many times my family's been like, when are you becoming a real doctor? I don't even talk about my film and videography projects with them, because that's just why am I doing that? Is that a hobby? But yeah, I really do honor that it is extremely challenging for many people, and for the people who are being more outspoken for it, because it's a practice, it's a choice to see whether or not you are really ready to do that, or if it is going to affect your livelihood. But I do want to underscore that it makes it so much more important that if you do feel like you can do that, then there's like, things are not going to shift unless there's enough individuals who are like, you know what, like I have held my tongue a lot for this thing. And how do I speak from a place where I'm not attacking people? Because that's hard. That's so hard. If you're doing any kind of social justice work, you're like, there's all these things that are wrong. How do we fix all of it? And if you're coming out with all of that, of course, it's going to feel like your job is at stake. But if you're coming from a place of, I feel these things, I feel unsafe, I'm not psychologically safe at work, or this particular event happened. I think that's something that comes in with the self-awareness, which is a journey, and the modeling, which is a journey, but at the core of that, I feel like once you're actually able to tap into why it is that you want to share, it's not so much of that conflict of like, this is me against my company. It's more of like, no, like I'm sharing because I'm a person who's sitting across from another person, and this is important for me to say. I acknowledge that though, and I hope that people, I trust and I see too that people over time are seeing more of the intergenerational trauma and how we're holding on to, in a physiological, neurological sense, all of these things, because it's not just in here. It's not like you wake up and then you decide today's the day where I will really stand up for myself and have healthy boundaries. Because, like what's popular meme, that healing is not linear. Like it goes like this sometimes, but you got to keep having at it. And I'm glad that as a coach, you get to help people through that process.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really honored to be able to be a part of that. It's hard because I see so many of the same themes across a lot of my Asian clients. But I think Tiffany brings up a really good point that is something that I cover a lot with my clients. So she said, you're punished for being vulnerable, right, as a kid, because it's seen as a weakness. And so then when you're constantly and especially since so many Asian families are so achievement oriented, that like your ability to get love from your parents or care oftentimes was tied to achievement, right? And your sense of worth was tied to achievement. And even if they like showed care through providing food and other ways that parents show care, the emotional care wasn't there, right? Or oftentimes hasn't been there and isn't there. And so then when you like have to achieve to get any kind of validation, right, and then that validation is then tied to your sense of emotional care and love from your parents, like then you start to associate worth and achievement with worth. And so Tiffany, you're bringing up a really good point, which is that like then as you get older, your work is your worth. Like literally it's providing you like one form of worth. And it's no different than when it was your grades, right? Now it's your career and how much money you make and whatever else. And so it's deep, difficult cycles to break. And so I think, Gina, that's what you're speaking to, is that there's generational cycles that we have to break. In kind of bringing it full circle, one thing that you said at the top that was like, I kind of thought was really fascinating is kind of tying it back to wellness and Eastern medicine and how integrated it is. But it's always been fascinating to me that like so much of Eastern medicines or Asian medicines and cultures are very like spiritual, like kind of combining so many of these pieces, yet we're also so emotionally disconnected in some ways. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, because it's always been a fascinating dichotomy to me, where I'm like, my mom will talk about the ways that eating this food connects to my heart and is supposed to be good for my like energy and my spirit and whatever else. Yet I'm like, but you literally don't feel anything, right? Like I can't feel you as a human being. So I'm just like, I always struggled with that. So I'm so curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple things I can speak to there. We live in a colonial world. So even any languaging that we have around defining, the standards of health or what healthy emotional expression can look like is through a Western lens. It's impossible for me to say anything without it being partly tied to a colonialist lens. And I identify with that. Sometimes my mom would also do a thing where she's like, this thing's really good for this part of your body, but she also never said that she loves me. We never cuddle and that kind of thing. And I think there is when you really lean into, your practice in cultivating compassion and empathy and forgiveness, because your family, a lot of refugees, immigrants have lived through so much hardship, and for their lives, they've accomplished a lot in order to support their families, in order to support you. And so, although you may want all of these expressions, or you may feel like in order for them to be fully healthy, that these are the things they need to do, there's also a very selfish part of that, because you are wanting those things for them. You are defining what their health is. And so, in order to really meet them where they're at, maybe them telling you that this bowl of food is going to save your life is their expression of love. You know, maybe them always asking for you to put on a sweater is their expression of love. And so they don't need for you to prompt them and prod them to develop the way that you, as I mean, I'm saying you, but I, you know, as a first 1.5 generation American, really Westerner, thinks they should act.
You're on mute.
Thank you. That's really powerful input, Gina. That's something that I've thought a lot about, you know, looking back and maybe being a little angry at my parents while growing up, like, why didn't you give me the love I needed? But then understanding that's not the love that they were given either. And that's not the love they, you know, they show their love in different ways. So it's really deep and complex, and just want to say thank you, Pam and Gina, so much again for this absolutely bomb conversation. Like, the chat's been blowing up. Y'all have hit on like some like really intense points, and just, yeah, I'm so honored to have been part of this conversation. But that being said, we are at time. So thank you guys again so much for everything. And I'll turn it over to Kenny if he has any last remarks.
Hey,
My
Gina,
last remarks.
before you go, can I just say, I just want to point to something Crash Bell said.
Oh yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Kind of sums up or wraps a point really nicely. Is they wrote, they did not know how to give us emotional care unless they got it, so we must forgive to break it. Because a lot of us, our parents didn't get that, so it's a hard thing to work through. But I think, you know, that's a really important point that I wanted to just call out, because I think that's kind of at the heart of it, right? Is we have to recognize their humanity and their pain and their stuff, even if we're trying to work through ours still. So I just wanted to call that out. You're on mute.
I was trying to be polite and be on mute. The only thing I really have to say is just thank you. This was insanely amazing. That's all I can really say. This has been absolutely great. Whoever missed out on this, like, shit, they fucked up. So like, all I can say is that Pam, Gina, Lisa, the whole AAPI team, Tiffany, K Flexecution, like, this is definitely one for the record books. I'm glad that we did record this, because I already have bigger plans for this. I'm just gonna leave it at that. I'm not gonna say anything else. But this was definitely beyond amazing, and a great way to kind of definitely close out our Asian American celebration and just Knowledge Fest. And this is mental health in particular is something that I've been extra about this year, because it's so important to not just me, but also for all the members of 100 Roses from Concrete and our associated people and participants in our program. So I really appreciate this being incorporated into it. And we're going to continue to take care of us. So screw what, you know, the place where you work says, whatever, you know, what society says. We're going to take care of us. And that's why we have the Rose Garden, to have these very special conversations. So once again, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Gina. We really appreciate y'all. Everyone else, have a great night. Definitely stay safe out there. It's crazy. Have a great Memorial Day weekend, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, Penny. Thank you, Lisa.